Winter in Montana doesn't ask for permission. It invades. It arrives like a silent predator, covering the world with a pristine white mantle that hides the hardness of the earth beneath. For John Kalin, a former Army Scout sergeant, winter was an old acquaintance, a companion in silence. With every step, the snow under his boots made a dry, muffled crunch, the only sound to break the almost sacred quiet of the forest. The air was so cold it seemed to crack inside his lungs, each breath a needle of ice. At his side, walking with a grace that belied its power, was Ghost, his wolf, a creature of gray and white fur, almost an apparition against the snow, with deep yellow eyes that seemed to see not just the physical world, but the invisible currents that moved through it. They were two solitudes that had found companionship in each other, far from the noise and fury of the world of men. John sought peace in the rigor of nature, a penance and a refuge. The forest didn't judge, it simply existed, and its laws were simple: survive or perish. It was a brutal honesty he no longer found in society. But on that day, something was different. Something broke the perfect symmetry of that frozen world. John stopped, and Ghost stopped with him, head raised, ears alert. The ex-sergeant knelt, running his gloved fingers over the mark in the snow. They were tire tracks, wide tires, from a heavy vehicle, probably a 4x4, and they were recent. The snow inside the grooves hadn't completely frozen yet. This made no sense. He was dozens of miles from the nearest road, in an area not listed on any official civilian trail maps. Nobody came out here. Hunters used routes farther south. Forest rangers didn't patrol this remote region in the dead of winter. Those tracks were an anomaly, a dissonant note in the symphony of silence. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the forest ahead. The afternoon sun, weak and pale, could barely penetrate the dense canopy of the pines, creating long blue shadows that stretched across the snow. Ghost let out a low murmur, a sound that vibrated in John's chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but of uncertainty, of something out of place. John nodded, as if the wolf had spoken to him in plain words. His hand instinctively went to the hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. The familiar weight of the weapon was a comfort, a reminder of a time when danger was a constant. He thought about turning back, about returning to his isolated cabin and pretending he hadn't seen anything. Peace was a precious and fragile commodity. But the scout inside him, the part that never truly retired, wouldn't let him. Curiosity was an itch under his skin, a question that demanded an answer. Who was out here, and why? He looked at Ghost, whose yellow eyes were fixed in the direction the tracks led. The decision was made without a single word. They would follow. The trail that John and Ghost followed wasn't a real trail. It was an absence of obstacles, an invisible path that only a trained eye could decipher. The tire tracks soon disappeared, covered by a new, thin layer of snow that had fallen during the night. But the signs of human passage remained. John moved with an economy of motion he had learned in places far more dangerous than this one. His eyes didn't just look forward but to the sides, up, reading the secret language of the forest. There was a pine branch broken at an unusual height, not from the weight of snow, but by something that had forced it aside. Further on, a small area of disturbed snow, as if someone had stopped to adjust their gear, trying to cover their own tracks but lacking the patience or skill to do it perfectly. He knelt again, pulling off his glove and touching the snow. It was still loose. Recent, very recent. And then, he caught the scent, faint, almost imperceptible, carried on the frigid breeze that swept down from the mountains. It wasn't the clean, resinous smoke of a pine fire. It was something more chemical, with an oily touch. Diesel, a generator. The sound of a generator would be muffled by the dense trees and the blanket of snow. But the smell traveled. Ghost smelled it too. The wolf stopped, his nose twitching in the air, his head turning slowly. The silent confirmation passed between them. They weren't following lost hunters or careless adventurers. This was something organized, something that needed power, something that wanted to remain hidden. With every step, John felt the old instincts sharpening, like a knife being honed on a whetstone. The feeling of being on patrol returned, the hypervigilance that had kept him alive in valleys and deserts on the other side of the world. Every tree was potential cover, every shadow a possible hiding place. He was no longer just a man walking with his wolf. He was a scout in enemy territory, and the territory, however familiar, suddenly felt alien and hostile. The peace he had come to find in these forests was unraveling, replaced by a tension he knew all too well. A tension that preceded contact. The invisible trail led them deeper and deeper into the heart of the woods, to a place where the sun never touched the ground, and the silence was so heavy it seemed to have form and weight. Ghost's instinct was the first to give the definitive alarm. The low murmur from before turned into a restrained growl, a deep vibration that emanated from his chest. The fur on his back stood on end. He wasn't looking ahead, but at a specific point in the dense line of trees to their right. John froze instantly, his hand sliding from the barrel to the trigger of his rifle. He trusted the wolf absolutely. Ghost didn't react to deer or bears this way. This was different. This was the recognition of an intelligent threat, of a predator that didn't belong in this ecosystem. John adjusted the rifle strap on his shoulder, the cold metal a counterpoint to the heat beginning to rise up his spine. He took a deep breath, the vapor of his exhale dissipating in the frigid air. To move forward now was to cross a threshold. The excuse of curiosity was gone. This was now a conscious choice to approach danger. His years in the army had taught him to assess risks, to calculate probabilities. Logic said to fall back. One man and a wolf against the unknown. The odds weren't good. But that same experience had also taught him that ignoring a potential threat could be even more dangerous. Whoever was out here, with a vehicle and a generator, hidden in the depths of the forest, wasn't here by accident, and their presence had already contaminated his sanctuary. To retreat now would be to live with a shadow over his shoulder, always wondering what was out there, always waiting for that shadow to stretch to his door. He looked at Ghost. The wolf didn't break his stare from the point in the forest, but his tail gave a single slight thump against John's leg. It was a sign of readiness, of loyalty. "All right, boy," John whispered, the sound swallowed by the snow. "Let's take a look, carefully." He began to move again, but differently now. No longer walking, but stalking. Each step was deliberate, placed in spots where the snow would make less noise. He used the trees as cover, moving from shadow to shadow, the rifle now in a ready position. The hunter had become the scout, and the scout was in reconnaissance mode. The world had shrunk to his immediate field of vision, to the subtle sounds of the forest, and to the low, constant growl of his companion. They were a unit of two, advancing toward the heart of a mystery that pulsed with a silent promise of danger. The forest around them began to close in. The trees, once majestic in their distance, now seemed to lean inward, their branches heavy with snow forming an oppressive ceiling that blocked what little light remained of the day. The world became a tunnel of grays, whites, and the deep green of the pines. The silence changed too. It was no longer peaceful, but expectant, dense. Every sound seemed amplified. The rustle of a startled bird, the groan of a branch under the weight of snow, the distant crack of something breaking. And with this shift in the environment, John's mind began to travel back in time. The smell of damp pine and frozen earth mixed with a phantom scent of dust and spice from a bazaar in Kandahar. The shadows between the trees transformed into the narrow alleys of a ruined city where danger lurked in every broken window. A sharper crack, closer to his left, made him freeze. His body reacted before his mind could process it. He dropped into a crouch, pivoting toward the sound, the rifle firm against his shoulder, his eye aligning with the sight. Ghost was beside him, low to the ground, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Nothing, just the wind whispering through the branches. But the adrenaline was already coursing through his veins. The memory hit him with the force of a punch. Another crack years ago. A dry twig stepped on in the darkness of a forest in Afghanistan. He was on watch, the last man in the patrol. The sound had alerted him seconds before the ambush. The muzzle flashes, the zip of bullets cutting the air, the cry of a comrade. He had survived on pure instinct, returning fire, crawling to cover, becoming a ghost in the night. He relived that moment in the blink of an eye, cold sweat trickling down his back despite the biting cold. He forced the memory back, forced himself to focus on the here and now. Montana, not Afghanistan. Wind, not enemies. But the line between past and present had become dangerously thin. The forest was no longer a refuge. It was a potential combat zone. Every tree was a hiding place, every clearing a kill zone. He continued to advance, but now with a caution that bordered on paranoia. He was no longer just following a trail. He was hunting, or being hunted. The echoes of war resounded in his head, a constant drumbeat guiding his movements. The precision, the discipline, the ability to become part of the environment, they were skills that had kept him alive there, and he would need them now. He didn't know what he would find, but one thing was certain. He was prepared for the worst. The man who sought peace had vanished, replaced by the soldier who had never really left the battlefield. They reached the end of the invisible trail abruptly. In a natural depression in the terrain, perfectly nestled between a dense grove of pines and a rock face, was the camp. The sight was surreal. There were 4 military-grade winter tents, an olive drab that almost merged with the landscape, arranged in a defensive formation. The snow had been carefully cleared from the pathways, creating clean lanes. Next to one of the tents, a diesel generator was wrapped in sound-dampening blankets, its low hum the only constant source of sound besides the wind. And on a makeshift flagpole, a tattered and faded American flag flapped slowly, almost like a ghost. There was no one in sight, no sentry, no smoke from a stovepipe, nothing, just the strange, orderly desolation. John and Ghost watched from a safe distance, concealed behind a large, snow-covered boulder. For 20 minutes, John didn't move, just observed. He scanned every inch of the camp, every shadow, every tent flap. It was a discipline etched into his soul. Before you enter an unknown place, you become part of the scenery and watch it until it reveals its secrets. But the camp revealed nothing. It was perfectly organized, yet unnervingly empty. The sense of alert emanating from the place was almost palpable, a pressure in the air. Ghost remained beside him, still as a statue, the low growl having ceased, replaced by a focused attention. Finally, John decided that waiting would yield no more information. He needed to get a closer look. With a subtle gesture, he signaled for Ghost to stay. The wolf understood, lying down in the snow, his yellow eyes never leaving the camp. John moved, not in a straight line, but in an arc, using every tree and shadow as cover. His steps were silent, his breathing controlled. He approached the nearest tent, rifle at the ready. The entrance flap was closed but not tied down. He paused beside it, listening. Only the hum of the generator and the whistle of the wind. With the tip of his rifle barrel, he pushed the flap aside and peered inside. The interior was as organized as the exterior. A military sleeping bag rolled up on a cot, a small camp stove, a closed laptop sitting on a metal case. A metal mug was next to the stove, and as John drew closer, he saw a faint wisp of steam still rising from it. They had left a short time ago, a very short time ago. A sense of urgency washed over him. Why would they abandon such a well-established camp in a hurry? What could have scared them off? Or maybe they hadn't fled. Maybe they were somewhere nearby, watching. The sense of alert transformed into a cold certainty. He hadn't discovered an abandoned place. He had walked into a trap. The adrenaline returned with full force. He backed away slowly from the tent, his gaze sweeping the line of trees that surrounded the clearing. The forest's silence was no longer peaceful, but waiting. It was the silence before the storm, and he was standing right in the middle of it. John entered the second tent, moving with the silent fluidity of a predator. This one appeared to be some kind of command center. Topographical maps of the region were spread across a makeshift table, held down by rocks. He ran his finger over them. They were military maps, detailed, far more precise than anything available to civilians. There were pencil markings, circles and arrows, coordinates that didn't correspond to any known town or landmark. In a corner, a pile of folded clothes, tactical uniforms with no insignias, clean and ready for use. Cooking utensils were washed and stored in a box. Everything spoke of discipline, of routine, but the warm mug in the other tent spoke of interruption. The contradiction was unnerving. It was as if the occupants had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind a perfectly functional camp. He picked up one of the maps. The area circled in red was exactly where he was. There were other markings, patrol routes, observation points. They weren't just camping, they were operating. They were controlling this piece of the forest. The realization hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. He hadn't discovered their camp. He had crossed their perimeter. From the moment he found the tire tracks, he had likely been under observation. Every step he took, every sign he read, might have been part of a script he didn't know. The hunter was the prey. The feeling of being watched intensified, becoming a physical presence, a weight on his shoulders. He turned slowly, scanning the tent's entrance, the canvas opening framing the dark forest outside. The trees were no longer just trees. They were observation posts. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were hiding places. He felt exposed, vulnerable, even inside the tent. Whoever they were professionals. The camouflage camp, the sound discipline, the organization, it all pointed to a trained unit, but they weren't regular military. There were no identifying marks, no open radio communications, nothing to link them to an official force. They were ghosts, just like him, but ghosts with a purpose he couldn't decipher. He stepped out of the tent, moving to the center of the camp. The biting wind seemed to carry whispers. He felt like an actor on a stage, illuminated by an invisible spotlight. He looked in the direction where he had left Ghost. The wolf was still there, a gray silhouette in the snow, but he was now standing, rigid, his gaze fixed on a specific point in the forest, far beyond the camp. John followed the wolf's gaze, and that's when he felt it. The air changed. The pressure increased. Someone was there, and they were close. The tension was a taut string about to snap. That's when he heard it. A snap. Sharp. Close. Behind him. The sound of a dry twig breaking under the weight of a boot. There was no thought, no decision, only years of training and survival instinct taking over. In a fraction of a second, John's body moved. He didn't turn. He dove to the side, rolling in the snow, using the motion to put himself behind a stack of metal crates. He landed in a crouch, the rifle already pointed at the spot where the sound had come from. His heart hammered against his ribs, a war drum in his chest. His senses were on fire, absorbing every detail. The hum of the generator, the whistle of the wind, the smell of diesel and pine, and the silence. The silence that followed the snap was more deafening than any noise. In that same instant, Ghost acted. The wolf didn't bark. He moved, a gray and white blur exploding from the cover of the trees, running not towards John, but flanking, moving in a wide arc to circle the camp and approach the source of the sound from a different angle. They had practiced this dozens of times, not with commands, but with instinct and anticipation. They were a team. John's mind was crystal clear. The past and present fused into a single moment of lethal clarity. The memories of ambushes were no longer hauntings. They were lessons. The posture of his body, the way he held the rifle, the way his breathing calmed and deepened. He was Sergeant Kalen again, the scout who became part of the terrain, who thought 3 steps ahead of the enemy. He saw no one. The forest remained motionless, a wall of dark trunks and snow. But he knew. The snap hadn't been an accident. It had been a mistake. Someone had made a mistake, and that mistake had given them a single advantage. Confirmation. They were not alone, and the enemy was human. The tension in the camp was so thick he felt he could cut it with a knife. The echoes of war were no longer echoes. They were the present reality. He was in combat. The only difference was that he didn't know who he was fighting, or why. He remained crouched, motionless, feeling the cold of the snow seeping into his pants. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. The only movement was the tattered flag, swaying in the wind like a wave from a forgotten world. He was in a stalemate, a duel of patience and nerves, him and the unseen observer. And somewhere in the darkness, his wolf was hunting. John's breath was a thin white cloud in front of his face. He didn't dare move. Every fiber of his being was tuned to the environment, waiting for another sound, another mistake. But it didn't come. Whoever was out there was disciplined. The first mistake would not be followed by a second. The feeling of being watched no longer came from a specific direction. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the forest itself had eyes. He felt a tingling on the back of his neck, a primal instinct screaming that he was in someone's sights. He risked a quick glance over the metal crate. Nothing, just the line of trees, impenetrable, dark. The shadows between the trunks were pools of blackness, perfect places for a man to hide. And it was there, in one of those pools of darkness, that he felt the gaze. He saw nothing, no outline, no glint of light on a lens, no difference in the texture of the darkness, but he felt it. It was an absolute certainty, an invisible connection that spanned the space between them. It was the gaze of a hunter on his prey. John held his breath. His training told him not to react, not to show that he knew. Any sudden movement would be an invitation for a shot. He remained perfectly still, trying to appear like a casual observer, not a knowing opponent. The wind howled a little stronger, kicking up a small cloud of snow from the ground and making it dance in the air. For an instant, the white curtain obscured the tree line. When it settled, the feeling had shifted. The intense focus of the gaze had moved, or vanished. He continued to wait. The cold was beginning to seep into his bones. His mind worked furiously. Who were they? Clandestine special ops? A private militia? The possibilities were all bad. What was certain was that they had established this place for a reason, and his discovery was a complication they would not tolerate. He thought of Ghost. Where was the wolf? He pictured him moving silently through the undergrowth, a gray phantom against the snow, using his keen senses to pinpoint the threat. Ghost was his best chance, his ace in the hole, but he was also his greatest vulnerability. The thought of something happening to the wolf was a cold knife in his chest. The feeling of being hunted awakened instincts in him that he had tried to bury for years. The adrenaline, the focus, the mental clarity in the midst of danger. A part of him, the part he hated, felt alive. He had left the war, but the war had never truly left him. It had been dormant, waiting for the right stimulus. And this camp, this gaze in the dark, was the stimulus. The sun was setting, and the twilight was painting the snow in shades of purple and gray. The darkness would bring a new layer of danger. He needed to make a decision, and he needed to make it now. The moment of truth had arrived, as cold and hard as the frozen earth beneath his knees. He was at a crossroads, not on a forest trail, but on a path within his own soul. The first option was retreat. He could pull back, move silently away, find Ghost, and disappear into the vastness of the forest. They could return to his cabin, reinforce its defenses, and wait. Pretend this day never happened. Erase the camp from his memory, just as its occupants had tried to erase it from the map. It would be the sensible choice, the survivor's choice, the choice of the man who just wanted to be left alone. The second option was confrontation, to investigate further, to uncover the truth behind this camp. Who were these people? What were they doing here in the heart of his refuge? This choice wasn't logical. It was visceral. It was the soldier's choice, the scout's choice, who doesn't leave an unidentified threat at his back. It was the choice of the man whose sanctuary had been violated and who refused to run. He glanced to the side, into the darkness where Ghost had disappeared. The wolf was a reflection of himself, loyal, wild, a survivor. What would Ghost do? The answer was obvious. Ghost would never back down from a threat to his territory, to his pack, and the two of them were a pack. As he pondered, a distant sound broke the tense silence. It was faint at first, a low hum that mixed with the generators, but it was getting louder. It was the sound of an engine, a heavy engine, like the one from the vehicle that had left the tracks in the snow. They were coming back. The time for decision had run out. To stay meant certain confrontation. To flee now would be a desperate race against a motorized enemy in terrain they knew better. A shadow materialized beside him, as silent as falling snow. It was Ghost. The wolf had returned, his body low, his lips slightly curled back to show the tips of his canines. He positioned himself at John's side, shoulder to shoulder, looking in the direction of the approaching sound. He hadn't found the sentry, but he had detected the new threat. The wolf was ready. His presence was the only answer John needed. He was no longer alone against the unknown. They were in this together. He couldn't run and let this cancer spread through the forest. He couldn't go back to his cabin and live in fear. The peace he sought wasn't the absence of conflict, but the courage to face it on his own terms. The cold seemed to deepen, and the sound of the engine grew clearer, closer. The moment of choice had passed. Now was the time for consequences. John Kalin exhaled slowly, the air forming a thick plume that dissolved into the impending darkness. The sound of the engine was now a guttural roar, unmistakable. A heavy vehicle climbing the hidden trail, its tires crushing the snow and the silence. The tension in the camp reached its peak, vibrating in the air like a bowstring about to break. Then the first light appeared. A powerful white beam cut through the darkness between the trees, sweeping across the frozen landscape. Another joined it. They were headlights. They were close, very close. John and Ghost remained motionless behind the cover of the crates. The wolf let out a growl so low it was more a feeling than a sound. John's mind operated with terrifying speed and clarity. This wasn't just a secret camp. It was a rendezvous point, a base of operations. And the secret they were guarding was so important that they had hidden it in the most inhospitable place they could find, something that needed to be deliberately erased from the surface. The beams of the headlights flooded the clearing, turning the camp into a ghostly stage of harsh light and deep shadows. John realized with a chill that he and Ghost were now in the most brightly lit part of the scene. If they moved, they would be seen instantly. The vehicle stopped at the edge of the camp, its engine idling, a metal beast breathing in the cold night. The doors opened with a metallic click. Human silhouettes emerged, dark against the glare of the headlights. There were 3 of them. They moved with the silent efficiency of trained men. They were armed. Assault rifles, visible even at a distance. John felt the weight of his own rifle in his hands. A hunting weapon against weapons of war. The odds were suicidal, but retreat was no longer an option. He had crossed an invisible line the moment he decided to follow the tracks, and now the finish line was coming toward him. He understood in that moment. Going back to the cabin, to the life of peaceful solitude, was impossible. He had seen what he shouldn't have seen. He knew they existed. To them, he was a loose end, and loose ends in their world were eliminated. His return to peace was an illusion. What lay before him was the end of something, the end of his quiet life, the end of his attempt to escape the past, or the end of them. With a slow, deliberate motion, John raised the rifle, resting it firmly on the metal crate. He looked through the scope, the world shrinking to a small circle. He centered the crosshairs on the first silhouette's center mass. Ghost was at his side, a coiled muscle ready to explode into action on his command. The man who wanted to forget the war was about to start one. With a metallic click that sounded like a death sentence in the forest's silence, he pushed the safety off his rifle. The sound was the last breath of his old life, and the first of his new reality. He was no longer a man hiding from the world. He was a soldier defending his territory, and crossing that line meant he would never be the same again. The war had found him in his last refuge, and he would meet it with fire and fury.